Welcome to Promote, Profit, Publish. I'm your host, Juliette Clark. And as most of you guys who've been listeners for a while know, when we start moving into November, December, I start moving into what you need to know for next year. What are the skills? Are you planning? All that good stuff, because it's awful if you wait till the last minute. If you get to January and you don't have a plan for the year, you're going to be a little bit behind. So today's guest, I'm actually going to introduce early, and the video is probably going to look a little bit different later. She's super, super busy, so I'm doing the introduction independent of her. So one of the things we're going to be talking about that's really relevant at this time is there is a great resignation going on in the United States. And that means for a lot of people that they are starting their own businesses, they're quitting their jobs, they're tired of that 9-to-5 grind. So today's guest is actually going to talk to us about the 5 generations that are currently in the workforce and how that impacts what's going on in corporate America and leads into next week's, which is Ryan Dowdy talking about the Great Resignation. People are really getting tired of the 24/7 work grind with technology. And so, and I have to add the difference in generations that are in the workplace. There are some that have different views when you have 5 generations there. So this week's guest is Joanna Dodd Massey. With more than 25 years of experience in media industry at companies such as Condé Nast, Lionsgate, CBS, Viacom, Discovery, and Hasbro, Dr. Joanna Massey is an experienced C-level communications executive and board director. She's managed crisis communications, brand reputation, culture transformations, which we are really going through at this time, and corporate social responsibility. Currently, Dr. Massey is a communications consultant, as well as the founder and CEO of Marketing Communications Think Tank, a benefit corporation whose mission is to shift the way we communicate about politicized social issues such as racism, the environment, and gun control, so that diversified groups of people can have constructive discussions and contentions and debate. She is also a sought-after corporate speaker and the author of 2 books, Culture Shock, Surviving 5 Generations in One Workplace, and Communicating During a Crisis, Influencing Others When the Stakes Are High. In addition, Dr. Massey is an adjunct professor at Columbia University, where she teaches a master level course in corporate communications. As a board director, Dr. Massey is a member of the National Association of Corporate Directors, the NACD. She currently serves as the independent board director for KULR Technology Group, which is a publicly held group, where she is the chair and nominating governance committee, as well as a member of the audit and compensation committees. She is also an independent director on the board of the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, the organization that oversees the Golden Globe Awards. In addition, she's an advisory board of financial startup 8B Education Investments and on the advisory board in the entrepreneurial ventures that promote social good. The Resolution Project, as a member of the Audit Committee, the University of Southern California, New York Alumni Club, as a member of Executive Board and Colors LGBTQ Youth Counseling Services as a non-executive director. Dr. Massey is an angel investor who advises female entrepreneurs at the seed funding stage. She previously served as a managing director at Golden Seeds, an early stage female-led firm with more than 125 million in total investments in over 170 female-run businesses, and she's a member of the Angel Capital Association. Dr. Massey holds 4 graduate degrees in both business and psychology, and she's a member of the American Psychology Association. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this interview. One of the reasons I brought this about is for many of you, the Great Resignation is an opportunity to change careers. For another group of my listeners, the Great Resignation and what's going on in corporate America today is an opportunity for you to pick up new entrepreneurial clients because people are leaving in droves and starting their own business. So I hope you enjoy this. Welcome to the show. It's so great to have you, Doctor.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to have this conversation today. It's by the time this airs, it will be towards the end of the year, and we've seen a huge amount of resignations this year. And your specialty about the 5 generations inside of the workplace might have a little bit to do with that. So can you tell us a little bit about the book you wrote about all of these people in the workplace?
I'd love to. It's one of my favorite topics, and they do have a little something to do with the Great Resignation that's happening, as it's been dubbed. And the book is Culture Shock, and it's about surviving 5 generations in the workplace. And one of the things that's going on is that we have these older generations, baby boomers, the silent generation. They're in their late 50s, late 60s, 70s, 80s, and they're not retiring. Why are they not retiring? We're living healthier, we're living longer, so we're working longer because we can and we want to. It's creating a log jam for these younger generations. And so what you've got now is you've got a span of 5 generations in the workplace. We've never had that. You've got new generations that are large. The millennials the baby boomers were the largest generation in the country. Then came the millennials. Now Gen Z is the largest generation in the country. And by the way, millennials are now the largest generation in the workforce because of their age and because of other people who are aging out. So, we are seeing a lot of changes happening because of that. And I always like to remind people who are resistant, as human beings, we are genetically, biologically predisposed to resist change. It's part of our system. But the people like the boomers and the Gen Xers and stuff who are like, what are these millennials doing? Who are they? Why are they changing all this stuff? What about these Gen Zers? Forget that the boomers were the original hippies, right? They sparked the hippie counterculture movement. They set out to change the world. They came into the workforce and they wanted to blow up everything, figuratively, not literally, because they were the peace-loving generation. And now we've got millennials and Gen Z doing the same. And it's sort of ironic that the original hippies are like, whoa, 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 whoa. No, that's not okay.
Exactly. And me being from the boomer generation, I'm also from a generation who was raised by people from, I believe, the greatest generation, which suffered a lot of the things that we didn't. So I feel like we have a different work ethic than some of the people that are down, in the other generations below us as well. Because our parents, they lived through the Great Depression. They lived through a couple, not 2 world wars, but for the most of them, 1 world war at least. And we've never had to experience that.
The boomers and Gen X had the boomers had the Korean War. Gen X had the Korean War. But really, I would say the closest, and we also had the Cold War. Especially in the 70s, that was very scary, but it wasn't an actual war. The closest we've come is, for at least in the United States, for millennials, is the attack on September 11th of 2001.
Yeah, exactly. So, so how does each interact in the workplace with one another, being that they're so different? There's a whole generation, and I forget what they're called in there, that were latchkey kids. That are so different from the boomers too. I think they were right after us. Is that right?
It's Gen X. So Generation X is the X actually is sort of like used in the X Factor or the X Files. It's the unknown generation. They were a very small generation because what happened was the boomers happened because the soldiers came back from World War II, big spike in birth rates. Suddenly you have this very large generation known as the baby boomers, who then turned around and, that generation plus a little bit more of the silence, who birthed the Gen X, they kind of tapered it down, like not as many kids, right? So it's a very small generation. And they ended up getting sandwiched between the boomers and millennials, who are 2 large generations. So Generation X is really now thought of as America's middle child, but you are correct. They did start out as being known as the latchkey kids when they were younger. They were the first generation to have both parents in the workforce in a big way.
Right. And from a work perspective, from what I understand, they're a little bit different because they're the ones in the workplace. They came home every day. They forged their own way. They don't like to really be told what to do as much. Is that right?
They are highly independent. They are a generation that was raised during a time where we believed the prevailing parenting technique was, these are mini adults, we treat them like little adults, they should basically raise themselves. And so a lot of them came home to empty homes or to a caretaker of some sort, maybe a family member, maybe not. They were really independent, left on their own. And as a result, what you have is a highly independent generation, but they are also a generation that followed, because of their size, they haven't had a big impact. We have never had a president of the United States who's a Gen Xer. And had Pete Buttigieg gotten the Democratic nomination, we would have gone from boomer to millennial and skipped over X. Wow. And as it is, we still don't have an Xer. So they've made an impact, but it hasn't been huge. And so what happened was, because of their size, partially, they came into the workforce and they sort of followed along with what the boomers said. You know, they did as they were told. You know, you go into corporate America, you work your way up the ladder, you work these crazy hours, you become a workaholic, you know, you do those types of things. So they really followed without asking a lot of questions or challenging that much. Part of the reason they didn't challenge is because they didn't really have a microphone with which to challenge, because back in those days, you had to be, you know, if you wanted to get something put in the press, you had to be somebody of importance. And so, but today, millennials and Gen Z, we have social media. Whatever they say can be heard, and it can be heard loudly. They have a microphone that no other generation has had. And so they are able to speak up in a way that Gen X couldn't, or wasn't able to do so with enough volume, right? And so what happens is Gen X now serves as somewhat of a bridge in the workplace, because I get the boomers, I came up the ranks with the boomers, but wow, what those millennials and Gen Zers are saying really makes sense to me. And I wish we had thought of that. And so let's roll with it. They're a good middle child. You know, they're like they're really good at balancing.
Good. So inside of the workplace and related to what's going on with the Great Resignation, how does all this fit in? Why are people leaving?
Well, I think it's twofold, and there's a lot of theories on this. So I will, share from my perspective what's going on, which is it's twofold. We were already seeing this prior to the pandemic. We just weren't seeing it in the same way. There used to be an attitude, if you're a boomer or a Gen Xer, you stay at the same company for at least 3 to 5 years. If you leave before that, it's because you're not good at your job and you couldn't keep it. You used to look at someone who job hopped and think that's a problem employee.
Yes.
Millennials have the exact opposite opinion. Their attitude is if they're still at the same company within 2 to 3 years, it's because they weren't good enough to get hired away. And so they job hop. Zers, Gen Z, worse. They will leave a company after 12 months, we've been seeing, to go to a friend's startup or a family startup or their own startup. And the part of it is twofold. These two generations don't believe that corporate America is the answer to their careers. And the reason they don't is because of the ages they were in 2008 during the Great Recession, when they watched their parents and grandparents and whoever and siblings get laid off without enough compensation and struggle for a long time. And so they don't trust financial industry. They don't trust corporate America in any sector. It's just they think that entrepreneurism is the way. So that's part of what we're seeing. And then the other part of what we're seeing is that the pandemic really gave all of the generations an opportunity to reassess life. And I especially look at the boomers and the Xers, especially Gen X, because they're not exactly retiring age right now. At their oldest, they're 55. So they're right at that sweet spot where they're like, I spent my whole career at my desk. I missed my kids' recitals. I missed soccer games. I ate lunch at my desk. I gave myself an ulcer. I missed date night with my husband or spouse or partner a million times. Like, for what? Here I just had a year at home with everybody. I can do my job perfectly well. Why am I living the rat race the way I'm living it?
Yeah, that's actually, I started my own first business in 2000, and it was much that way because I either had a commute or I was on an airplane, and I just didn't want to be like that anymore. That's how my parents were. They missed, they couldn't get off work to do all of that. So I didn't miss much of my child's childhood, either children. So from the entrepreneurial standpoint, this is what I worry about with them, because I see a couple things with what we do. First of all, I see the boomers coming in, they've worked in corporate America their entire lives, and now they want to start a business, and they really don't know all the ins and outs because they've always gotten a paycheck. So they don't know those little things to run a business. And then I worry about the other end of the spectrum, because only staying at a job a year, do you really understand what it takes to be an entrepreneur? So what are your thoughts on that? And, is there?
So I'll address it from both sides. Let me just start with the latter. As young people coming in, wanting to be entrepreneurs who don't really have enough of a business background, as I do angel investing also. So as an investor, we always put someone with more experience in the mix. We always do it because of exactly what you said. The entrepreneur isn't always open to it, but if they're not open to it, that says something about the entrepreneur, and that's not necessarily an investment I'm going to make personally as an investor. So, and I think there are plenty of young people who recognize that they do need advice and consultation and are willing to take it. Not all of them, but many, many, many. From the other spectrum, the older people who have always had a paycheck and now are trying to be entrepreneurs and are like, oh my gosh, what is this wild, wild west crazy world? This is not as easy as it looks.
Right.
Type response. They interestingly do very well bringing in young people. And one of the things I didn't say earlier when we were talking about the Great Resignation is that another part of the problem is that we have a generation now, Gen Z in particular, but also younger millennials. And by younger millennials, I'll say people between the ages of 25 and 30 right now, 31. This is a group that in order to get into college had to have worked at a nonprofit. Some of them have started their own nonprofits. Many of them have run their own startups, whether it be a t-shirt business or something else of that nature. I can't tell you how many of my friends' kids were doing like literally their own businesses and getting money that they then used to put themselves through college. They then needed to get more of that practical experience during college. By the time these kids hit the workforce, they are more experienced and more educated than any generation that's ever entered a workforce before. Some of them have served as CEOs and presidents of their own companies, CMOs, CTOs, CIOs, like they've sat in the seats. So they come in and we tell them, go sit at that desk and punch a bunch of numbers and do a bunch of administrative stuff. They're bored to tears. Yeah. We're not challenging them. And so they say to us, well, I need more responsibility. I want to be involved in that project. When do I get to meet with the president? How come I don't get to meet with the client? And we have this attitude like, you're not allowed to, you're too junior. You don't have the experience, but they do. And we have to recognize that or they leave.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Because I remember my first jobs out of college, I was bored to tears before I actually got in and did that. But I think the boomer generation, there were a lot of people who had their own yard jobs, their own. I mean, I had a job from the time I was 15 years old. So I think there are a lot of people that do sort of get into their own thing as well. So what are people doing during the Great Resignation? Because that's what we're really prepping people for is if you're going to start your own business, you need help. Like you just don't open one day and, you're doing the accounting and you're doing the sales. And what do these people need to understand to do that?
I think that there are a lot of organizations like what you're doing who are helping provide information now and training on how do you market yourself? How do you, where do you get the right accountant, the right virtual assistant, the right virtual CFO or CMO, or, how do you do social media? All of this kind of stuff that really we don't understand, because it's one thing to have a good idea, but you've got to support it on the back end, right? With legal and financial processes, but then you've got to promote it. And promoting it can take as much time as doing the work itself. I speak from experience. Yes. As someone who's been in corporate America for a very 3 decades, but also been an entrepreneur. And running my own consulting firm. The amount of work I have to do to promote myself and network and do on social media, plus actually do the work that I get that comes in, plus be the lawyer that does the contracts. Like it's a lot. and it is hard to manage. And so it's about, taking the time, which they don't have, but taking the time to educate yourself and network and get the contacts you need so that you can bring in other people. I now use this virtual CFO. I wish I'd brought this woman in years ago. So.
Right. I know those are the kinds of things. We did a whole revamp of our processes this year to streamline. And it's like, why didn't I do this before? Now I'm freed up. So it's kind of crazy, but that's what we're seeing though, is a lot of these people just jumping in, and they do have a great idea, but they don't have what I'll call the foundation. Mm-hmm. So they're sort of built on sand when they get into trouble, because they can't, it's hard to wear all the hats inside of a company. So which generation is faring the best on this, in your opinion, from the outside looking in?
Well, I mean, I can tell you actually from studies that have been done that the baby boomers financially are in the best position of any generation in the United States right now. Mm-hmm. We are about to experience a massive transfer of wealth in the US as the baby boomer generation ages out and passes away. It's not happening en masse just yet, because they're, between the ages of 55 and I think 72 or 73 right now. So we're not seeing it that in a big way, but we will. And that transfer of money will go to the millennials. Right? Mm-hmm. Because Gen X is primarily silent. Parents were silent generation and some boomers, but boomers primarily birth millennial. So, that will certainly help the millennials. Gen X is struggling financially because for two reasons. One is they're right at that point in the corporate pyramid where they should be hitting the C-suite, and those boomers and silent generations not leaving. So they're stuck. And they're doing that thing that we were just talking about, trying to go out and be entrepreneurs, or they're stuck in the job. Mm-hmm. And there's only so much hopping around you can do if you can't get to the top. And the second thing is Gen X has lived through 4 recessions during their career. And that's done some damage. Absolutely. They are not doing as well financially as the boomers. Millennials graduated, right? The oldest of them graduated during the 2008 recession. And so that really has hurt them financially. The pandemic hurt again. And I'm not necessarily talking about office workers. Now I'm talking about more people who are in sectors where they're not at the office. They're, more on like some sort of a factory line or in a job, unless you work at like an Amazon or a Walmart or, in an industry that was considered first responder. Mm-hmm. They got hit really hard. Gen Z to be determined how well they'll do. I mean, they're really at their oldest in the workforce 24 right now. So they've just started.
Yeah. And I know my kids did very well. I have a millennial and a Gen Z, I believe, that they were both what do we call them during the pandemic? Urgent workers, or the people who work during it?
Necessary. They were, yes, I know. I'm blanking on the word myself, but they were necessary workers.
They were necessary workers. So they both survived. They've survived very well during that. Well, this has been really interesting. Thank you so much. And then where can we find your books if we're interested? You have 2 books.
I do. Thank you so much. They're on Amazon.com. They're also, Culture Shock was in Barnes and Noble, but it's 2 books. One is Culture Shock, which I talked about, and the other is called Communicating During a Crisis, Influencing Others When the Stakes Are High. I talk a lot about how people respond to stress, and especially I talk about neuroscience, but I don't talk about it in a dry way. My writing is very, I think it's entertaining. It's easy reading. And I love to inform people like what goes on in your mind when you get stressed, so that you know what your reaction is when you hit that fight, flight, or freeze moment, but you also know what somebody else's reaction is and how to communicate with them. And I provide a lot of tools and stuff like that. Communicating During a Crisis is a shorter book. And I used to say to people, it's a really quick read. You'll get through it in like an hour and a half. And I've been told I have to stop saying that because people are underlining and taking notes when it takes longer than an hour and a half. I'm like, oh, okay.
Love it though. It's almost like the 5 language thing where, are you speaking the right love language in a crisis? Are you speaking the same language they are, as far as, if you're someone who freezes and shuts down versus someone who's going to, I don't know, what would you call it? Sort of vomit emotion all over you, how are you going to react in those situations? That's something really crucial for people.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much. This has really been great.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking with you.